Welcome. As Chris mentioned, the topic today is rain gardens. I am far from an expert when it comes to rain gardens. I was involved in the construction of all four of the rain gardens that have been constructed here in recent years, so I do have some firsthand experience. I think the most valuable experience I have regarding rain gardens is the value of them. Our rain gardens have turned to be labor savers. But I'm going to get back to that in a second and just talk about rain gardens in general. First, top secret that I don't want you to share with anybody, but I've been told that the most important thing that landscape architects learn in their training is that water runs downhill. So remember that, water runs downhill. And I always thought that rain gardens were put at the bottom of a slope, but really it's more valuable to capture the water upslope before it traveled all the way downhill. And the reason for that is you're capturing the runoff from a storm before it erodes or washes out mulch and stuff. And that's the way the rain gardens here at the Arboretum have saved us a lot of time and labor. For instance, this rain garden, it was preceded by a much smaller rain garden that probably only came out to about here and didn't extend another 20 feet longer. And it was also quite a bit narrower than it is now. And a rain garden that's too small can actually be perhaps worse than no rain garden at all, because the small rain garden would capture the rain, and in a typical heavy rain, it would overflow, and suddenly what would have been, runoff over the duration of the rain, suddenly there was this big torrent coming out of this rain garden. But even without a rain garden at all, the flow of water would wash out the gravel road that's just down below here. I don't think you can see it from here, but just take my word for it. There's a gravel road. And since we installed this rain garden, except for one occasion, we have not had to ever move gravel back into the road bed. It hasn't been eroded. So the land continues to slope off here for a long distance, so the water's going to run downhill. But by stopping it at this point, we stop the flow of the water, stop the erosion and the washing of the gravel. So it's been a really big labor saver. And when we see the next rain garden, it wasn't so much that the runoff was causing erosion in that situation, but it was washing the mulch out of beds every time we had a heavy rain. And so now that the water is captured there, it's not washing mulch out of beds and onto the sidewalk, so we don't have, several hours of cleanup after every rain. And I think one thing to keep in mind is, we've always in this area tend to have those heavy downpours with the summer thunderstorm, but now most of the year we seem to get heavy downpours when it does rain. So it's even more valuable to have a rain garden to capture runoff before it causes erosion or other wash. A really important thing to remember about a rain garden is that it's often a very dry area. It is wet when we get a rain, and then once that water has drained away, and if it's a long time in between rains, then a rain garden often becomes a very dry area in the garden. So the plants need to be selected carefully. Plants that can tolerate both water, sometimes standing water, for a number of days, but also extended periods of drought. But in nature, the floodplains of rivers go through that same cycling of, standing water to parched dryness when, you know, it's been a while in between rains. So there's not a shortage of plants that are suitable for a rain garden. You just have to choose them wisely. I realized I forgot to mention one thing about a rain garden. In the time that it's holding water, that water, instead of running off and ending up in the Atlantic Ocean, has time to percolate into the soil. Now, in this area, a lot of our subsoils drain real slowly, so probably not too much of it ends up down in the groundwater, recharging the groundwater. It probably mostly moves into the soil horizontally. Of course, some of it's lost through evaporation, but some of the water that's trapped in a rain garden does end up recharging the soil, which when we have a dry spell is you know, a really big benefit, because the areas around a rain garden stay moist a little bit longer than perhaps other parts of the garden. I can detail some elements of construction. We did incorporate a fair amount of gravel. Well, after excavation and, you know, building essentially a dam on the lower end to hold the water, we did incorporate a fair amount of gravel into the soil. You could use any sort of pea-sized gravel. We tend to use permatill, which is a gravel that's made from shale that's been puffed at really high temperatures. So it works just like a you know, regular gravel. It's just lighter weight. But the weight of the gravel is not important in the rain garden, so regular pea gravel is probably cheaper than permatill. You know, beyond the excavation, the forming of berms, dams around the rain garden, and the incorporation of gravel to increase the infiltration of water into the soil, there's really not that much more to a rain garden. Rain gardens are not lined, like sometimes we line a hole in the ground to create a pond because we're not expecting the water to stick around, but rather we hope that it'll, you know, drain into the subsoil. Rain gardens can be built in sun or shade. You just have to choose the plants appropriately. You know, the range of plants that work in a rain garden include both herbaceous plants and woody plants, trees and shrubs. I suspect there's some annuals that would be perfectly happy in a rain garden, but I don't know any off the top of my head. I think that's all of my general comments on rain gardens. We'll start to look at plants that are suitable for rain gardens. But I do need to make the general point, you know, if I talk about iris or I talk about sedge, it's important to remember that in any genus, you know, there might be plants that are suitable for a rain garden, but it doesn't mean, even though this iris in front of me is very suitable for rain garden, it does not mean that all iris are suitable for a rain garden. Or like the sedge over here, which we'll talk about in detail in a moment, not all sedges are appropriate for a sunny rain garden, but many are. And in a rain garden, you can experiment. Chris has his hand up.
I do have my hand up. International sign for I got a question.
Yes.
Got a couple online questions. I think the timing is really good for you, Doug. Someone was wondering, do we need to ever water the plants in the rain gardens during dry spells?
Oh, and do I need to repeat the question?
No, they can hear it because I got my microphone on.
Okay. The only time we've watered plants in a rain garden in a dry spell was when they were newly planted. Once they're established, we leave them to their own devices. Now, in my 4 years, or this is my 5th summer at the Raulston Arboretum, we've not had a drought like the drought in 2007. You know, if the drought was really long, perhaps we would water things just to keep them alive until the weather returned to more normal rainfall.
Okay, we have another question, and it might be able to be read two different ways. Someone's asking, what is the, where'd it go? Do you know the depth of the excavation, which might be how deep are you standing below grade, but it also might be how deep did you incorporate the material into the soil? So maybe answer both if you could.
Well, I don't know that, well, the volume of the rain garden might be more important than the actual depth, because the rain garden needs to be big enough that it'll capture the amount of runoff from a average rain, whatever that is. So, if it was narrow, it could be deeper. If it was shallow, it could be wider. So I would say here, it's probably was excavated to about somewhere between 18 and 24 inches. And then once that soil was excavated, the gravel was worked into probably another 10 to 12 inches.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, this one might look a little bit deeper, so you might have put the soil that you excavated around the edges.
Yes.
And kind of made a little volcano effect on part of the side, so it might look a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And we have one final question before we move on to the plants, Doug. Anne is wondering if mosquitoes are a problem.
They haven't been, because the soil here drains in 2 to 3 days.
Right. And that's not long enough for the mosquitoes to complete their life cycle.
No. Yeah, so no, I hadn't ever thought of the issue of mosquitoes. Usually I work with other people that the mosquitoes like, so I'm not even aware of the mosquitoes. And the Arboretum's never been really bad for mosquitoes, except the far west side, which is damp and shady. Other questions? No? Okay. Well, I might step forward. The genus Carrick, the sedges, are very grass-like plants, but the little device that when you take botany class, everyone learns is sedges have edges. Their stems are triangular, so you feel the edge there. Things are often in threes, but it's a big genus. There are a lot of them that look very similar one to the other. So often, only the experts can look at and be sure what they're looking at. But we have two sedges here that are from a very reputable nursery in this area. And sedges, in my experience, fall into two groups. Woodland natives that are often fairly drought tolerant, and are nice little grass-like additions to the shade garden. And then the ones like sun seem to primarily be ones that like sun and wet. And so they're a natural plant for a rain garden or the edges of a pond. Many species. This is one that's fairly showy, and I'm going to call this fruit. This is Carrick's Squarosa. I think Squarosa is referring to the roughness of these seed heads. The Carricks are monoecious in that the plants have both male and female flowers, but they are like, if you think of corn, the male flowers on a corn plant, which is a grass and not a sedge, are the flowers up on top of the stalk, and then the part of a corn plant that makes the corn on the cob is the female part. Well, this Carrick's bloomed long enough ago that I don't see any of the male flowers. The male flowers would have been slender little catkins that would have shed the pollen, and then the flowers would have been shed. But these seed heads remain attractive for many months. They'll turn brown in the fall and often be attractive through the winter as well. Some of the Carricks are showier than others. This is and some of them are clump formers and others are runners. Squarosa You know, they're planted fairly thickly, but they are distinct separate plants. You know, Carrick's Muskingum-ensis is another native one, and that one is the palm sedge, and it spreads. And I think spreading plants are even better for a rain garden than clumpers because they tend to slow down the water more. So, you know, I love this plant. I think it's showy. You know, it's not colorful like a knockout rose, but, you know, gardening's just not about color, color, color. We also have these interesting seed heads. Okay. Irises. Most of our sun-loving irises that are native to the southeast are wet site plants. In the garden, they don't have to have wet, but that makes them a perfect plant for a rain garden because they will tolerate dry and they will tolerate standing water. Now, our two native woodland iris, Iris cristata and Iris verna, are not wet site plants, but most of our sun-loving plants are. This is, and you know, the usual thing gardeners always say, you should have seen my garden last week. These irises are nearly done. Later on, I'll grab a flower of this iris at the back of the garden when I'm over that end. But this is a Louisiana iris. The Louisiana iris are hybrids between 3 or more of our southeast native irises, primarily native to the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi River Valley. But this is one called Dixie Deb. I'll pick that one good flower back there. But the Louisiana irises spread fairly steadily, you know, so they'll do a good job at filling in a rain garden. I'm going to step over here to another selection of a native iris. Iris versicolor. Oh, here's a better looking flower. Iris versicolor is another native wet side iris. This is a really beautiful selection called John Wood. It's, again, mostly done blooming, but we have a couple really nice flowers there. And Iris virginica, very closely related to Iris versicolor. It's just a larger growing plant, and you know, this one of its last flowers is not in great shape anymore. It's on its way out, but the typical color of Iris virginica is blue-violet, but this is a mauvey pink selection. And I'm not going to immediately pull its name out of my hat. But Iris virginica, another excellent wet rain garden plant. And I think both versicolor and virginica are really beautiful foliage plants through the summer. I love the Louisiana iris, but their foliage tends to get a little tired looking in the summer. And if you've ever lived with them, you've noticed that come fall, they start putting up new shoots. They're sort of summer dormant, even though they retain the foliage they have now. That foliage gets shabby. And you know, come in the late summer, fall, when they put up new foliage, you can cut away all the old foliage. And I see another thing I need to mention about Louisiana iris. I probably should be calling these Louisiana hybrids. They, despite being hybrids, they're still quite fertile. That's a more normal sized seed pod there. And I think it's best if you cut the flower stalks off and don't let the Louisiana hybrids go to seed, because you'll get, you know, they'll be like a litter of mongrel puppies, and that, you know, they won't necessarily look like the parent plant, and they very well might not be as beautiful as the parent plant. And if you let them go to seed, you just end up with this hybrid swarm, and you might lose the desirable one. When you do cut the flower stalks off, and these iris, cut the stalk all the way to the ground, because it's going to die anyway. That's just its normal life cycle. and they do look quite a bit better if you cut them off. Because, you know, some seed heads, like the seed heads of the older varieties of Siberian iris, are attractive, and they don't seed around that much, but Louisiana irises aren't attractive, and I think it's good to prevent them from going to seed. Okay. I'm standing right next to a palm. Our native palms, especially Sable Miner, the Dwarf Palmetto, and this is I think this is a dwarf selection of Sable Miner. I'm going to cut this older frond off, which is starting to turn yellow because it's going to go by before too long. Sable Miner is native to, I don't remember if it extends into the coastal plain of Virginia, but certainly North Carolina, all the way, you know, down through Florida and around the Gulf Coast. Sable Miner is very widespread and fairly variable in size, but one thing that always remains true about Sable Miner, it does not make a trunk above ground. It's described as having a trunk underground, and they do sort of, the moment the seed germinates, it starts growing, I'll just call it a trunk underground. And, you know, an established plant, you have to dig down maybe almost 18 inches to get under the bottom of that. And if you're going to transplant them, you have to do that. And it's no fun because it's a lot of digging quite deep. But they're really beautiful, you know, an evergreen sort of exclamation point in the garden year round. This is the flower stalk. The flower stalk is a whole lot taller than the foliage. It'll get, you know, 6 feet at least, arch over. It's sort of this foam of small white flowers. And it's both a really good plant for pollinators, and then the birds, some birds will eat the fruit over winter. At the Arboretum, we often cut those fruit stalks off because we end up with so many seedlings around the Arboretum. We're just sort of trying to cut down on maintenance. But I love Sable Miner for its year-round presence in the garden. And it's a floodplain plant, so it'll go, you know, it'll tolerate these swings of moisture. Maybe while I'm here, I'll talk about this shrub. Another native plant that's superb for a rain garden is the Virginia sweet spire. If I was closer to the camera, I'd hold it up to you so you could smell the flowers. They're very fragrant. They sort of smell a bit like vanilla to my nose. The scientific name is Itea virginica. It spreads underground, so a little bit difficult to use in a smaller garden, but great where you have room for it to spread. And being a floodplain plant, again, it'll tolerate standing water and also tolerate average garden moisture, so you could grow it in either situation. It's deciduous, but generally the foliage turns a brilliant scarlet to crimson before shedding the leaves. And though I always hate to say deer don't eat it, I've used a lot of it in a client's garden that was thick with deer and they never touched it, you know, knock on wood. And if you want me to find this is a newer cultivar with, you know, again, probably something we touch on in every program, how nowadays we have cultivar names and trademark names. And this cultivar name, you could actually almost pronounce it as a word, Bail-Teon, B-A-I-L, reminds me that it's an introduction from Bailey Nursery. Last week we met the Easy Elegance roses that are so superb from Bailey Nursery, but they breed a wide range of plants. And the trademark name is Love Child. I probably don't want to know the story behind that name. But really good plant, fragrant, good pollinator plant. I don't know that, I don't think there's any fruit or seed that is of is used by wildlife, but that might just be my ignorance. I'm standing here next to one of our native hibiscus, and the genus hibiscus is large one. Our native hibiscus are herbaceous perennials, ones that die to the ground each winter. They don't have permanent woody stems, but many hibiscus are shrubs or trees with permanent woody stems. And many hibiscus are also tropical, so not plants we would use in the garden, but maybe use for summer containers. And it's another example where some hibiscus love wet sites and others don't. The only common woody species of hibiscus is Hibiscus syriacus, the Rosa Sharon. I don't think it would tolerate wet. It's very drought tolerant. But this is Hibiscus coccineus, the Texas star. I guess it's 5-petaled big starry red flower for quite a long time. The leaves look a little bit like a marijuana leaf, but not quite. It's one of my favorite herbaceous perennials, certainly in my top 1,000, because it's showy in bloom. Hummingbirds and large butterflies will visit those big flowers. A big, like a swallowtail butterfly will land on one of those petals. It's like a perfect landing pad for them. And then the seed pods are pretty, and the stems that have a lot of purple in them, sort of gray and purple this time of year, will turn silver in the winter. So I generally leave the herbaceous hibiscus standing all winter. But again, a plant that doesn't have to have a wet site, but will certainly tolerate both wet and dry. And we have a number of other native herbaceous hibiscus, like Hibiscus moschutus. That's the common one you see in ponds, usually with a cream-colored flower, often with a bright burgundy red center, occasionally pink. Hibiscus grandiflora, which we've probably met when we've visited the perennial border, with beautiful fuzzy silvery gray maple-shaped leaves. And then there's all those hybrid ones with the huge flowers. They have, a number of our native species as parents, so you could certainly include them in a rain garden as well, because they, again, don't have to have a wet site, but would tolerate the periodic wet spells in a rain garden. Those ones with huge flowers have a very different aspect compared to our wild ones, but they have their place in the garden. They're fun. All right. The butterfly weeds, Asclepias, again, they vary in what they want. Some are dryland species. Hibiscus incarnata, this plant here, you have you'd probably likely guess this was a butterfly weed, since it has those orange aphids on the stem. And somebody's going to ask me, what do we do about the aphids? Nothing. But Asclepias incarnata is the swamp milkweed or swamp butterfly weed. And so again, a plant that doesn't have to have a wet site, but will certainly thrive in one. And we were very pleased. There's some additional plants of this, just 10, 12 feet from here, that were completely eaten by monarch butterflies already this year. So we're used to seeing monarch caterpillars late in the summer and early fall, but we were really thrilled to have this early crop, because that will mean more adults laying more eggs and producing more monarch butterflies over the course of this summer. Okay. Oh, a bulb that we use in the rain garden. There's a couple labels here. This foliage is now, can you follow me if I travel up here? Yeah. These seed stalks are the seed stalks of a Camassia, Camas Lily. And we have one Camassia that's native to the eastern North America. And I've never seen it in the wild, and only rarely have I seen it in the nursery trade. But the Camassias that are native to the Pacific Northwest are readily available from the mail order bulb merchants, and they're all really good for us. This is Camassia Cusickii, which is Cusickii, and it's a pale blue. It gets better every year. It's up here on this dry edge of the, up above the rain garden, but we also grow it down in the wet. But there's a couple other species, but if you go on to a mail order bulb nursery in the fall, you'll see a number of different species, and they're all good for us. Okay. Let's see. And not making a significant show yet, but one of the really beautiful bulbs that can be grown in the rain garden are some of the spider lilies. And this is a good example where the common name's not too useful, because there's a number of unrelated plants named spider lily. But in this instance, I'm talking about Hymenocallis. Hymenocallis means beautiful membrane. Callus being beautiful, hymen referring to a membrane. If you think of I'm going to need to graph a sixth finger on my hand so I could illustrate a typical amaryllis or lily family member with 6 petals, but we'll pretend this is 6, and it has long spidery white petals. I can only think of only one Hymenocallis that's not white. But then in between the base of each petal is this translucent white membrane. And so that's where they get the scientific name of Hymenocallis. They vary. There's a few species that are fairly small. There are other species like tropical giant that'll be about this tall in bloom. And they're all really beautiful. And again, many of the Hymenocallis will tolerate wet and prefer wet, but do your research, because there's some species that don't. One of the showiest Hymenocallis, which would probably be almost impossible to grow in a garden, rain garden, or in a pond, would be the Cahaba Lily, which is native to, well, I've seen it in South Carolina and Alabama, but in the rocky rivers of the Southeast, and I've also seen it near the Riverbanks Zoo in Columbia, South Carolina. But it always tends to grow in flowing water, but it's a really beautiful thing. I think one of its other names is the Rocky Shoals spider lily. Let's see, let's talk about grasses. Again, you'll need to do your research, because some grasses wouldn't tolerate periodic inundation, but many of our natives, even some of the prairie grasses, especially the prairies of the lower Midwest, will tolerate periodic standing water, because they might grow in an area like, Oklahoma or somewhere where there are often long dry spells, but then there's a monsoonal rain and suddenly they're having to put up with standing water. This is selection of one of our Switchgrass Panicum, and they're good for a rain garden. I've used a non-native grass, Miscanthus, in a rain garden, because again, they will tolerate those swings in moisture. Which other ones would I put in a rain garden? I don't know if any come to mind right now. Now, this is a plant I've grown many times before and never succeeded with it, but it's thriving here in the rain garden. This is a South African sort of shrubby member of the, my mind just went blank. The flowers look like a Veronica. I'm sort of thinking it's more related to verbena than Veronica, but it's Gomphostigma, which is referring to a club-shaped stigma, virgatum. And this is the silver leaf form of it. It can also be green-leafed, but it's just starting to bloom, and it'll bloom all summer. I've tried it sometimes in the perennial border, and I think because it was usually consistently dry in the perennial border, it didn't persist. But I'm now in the lowest part of the rain garden where there will be standing water if it's more than a small rain. So it's tolerating that, and I would say even thriving. I'm gonna grab that last flower of Dixie Deb. Now the more modern selections of Louisiana Iris are bigger, and often all sorts of weird color combinations and very roughly. And they might be exactly the ones you love best, but I like the simple form of Dixie Deb. And I hope sometime you get a chance to see her in full bloom, because it's many, many layers of flowers, whereas a lot of the more typical Louisiana, it's sort of a single layer, a whole lot shorter. Dixie Deb is, well, this one's only blooming up at about 3 feet, but I think some of those at the moisture end of the rain garden are probably closer to about 4 feet. It's an old variety, but one of my favorite Louisiana Iris. And I realized we have a real interesting native shrub here. This is Cyrilla, Cyrilla. What is it? Cyrilla racemifolia, I think, racemiflora. But I don't know if you can see from here, it's in bud. These slender spikes of flowers are going to look a lot like the Virginia sweet spire. They're going to be a spike of small cream-colored flowers. And when it blooms, it's just covered with pollinators. I'm struggling I don't think I'll call it semi-evergreen. It's really slow and late to lose its foliage in the fall, and it loses it over a long period of time. But the leaves color up usually scarlet and orange, well, maybe mostly scarlet before they're shed. So it's showy in bloom. It's handsome in fall foliage, and these are young plants. I guess they probably get about 8 to 10 feet tall, and they're on the edge of the rain garden where they do tolerate the periodic inundation. And I saw this growing in the wild on the coastal plain of Georgia, and along the highways. They'd always be in the ditches along the road where they probably had to put up with wet many times over the course of a year. I think, on the edge of the rain garden is a river birch, and with that common name, you're probably not surprised to see it thriving in here. But river birch is one of our native trees that typically occur in floodplains. I don't think river birch would tolerate I don't think it would tolerate standing water continuously, but it certainly will tolerate that. Bald cypress is another native tree. Not that I'm focused on native trees, but that would tolerate standing water periodically. And I know we see places where bald cypress are growing in water year round, but that's not really their natural habitat. There's a bald cypress swamp on Highway 10 shortly after you cross from, Lord, I'm going to make a fool of myself, from Louisiana into Texas. Is that right? Nobody's helping me. But it's a rest stop there, and they have a lot of interpretive signage in that bald cypress swamp with a boardwalk through it. And they made the point that when humans logged the old bald cypress trees for lumber, they changed the hydrology of the area, and they wanted to have the water there year round so they could float the logs out. But more typically, bald cypress would grow in a floodplain situation where they would have standing water in the spring and the fall, but not typically during the summer. And the bald cypress, with standing in flooded growing conditions year-round, do not grow quite as strongly as the ones that have just the seasonal flooding. And indeed, that comes back to our native iris that are native to the floodplains of the lower south. The fact that Louisiana iris are semi-dormant in the summer is a reflection of two things: that those areas tend to be drier in the summer, but also they will often grow under trees in a floodplain and grow actively through the winter months when they don't have when the trees don't have foliage, and then in the drier, shadier summer they go semi-dormant. So just more information than you probably cared to know.
Doug, was
yes.
that Lake Caddo? Caddo, I believe.
I don't remember the name.
That's a large lake on the border of Texas and Louisiana.
Is it on Highway 10?
Dammed. What?
Is it on Interstate 10?
Might be too far north for that.
Okay.
That might be closer to.
Yeah, I just don't remember. You know, that's now more than a decade ago. Okay. Are there additional questions before we travel on?
We do have a question online that Nancy just asked.
I have. I just want to try to get a feel for the landscape there a little bit more. It looks like, though, it's on a slope on the majority of your rain garden at the upper end of the slope, but then there's lots of little hills and valleys in there. Is that correct?
I didn't hear any of that.
Oh, I thought you were hearing that.
No.
She's asking you about the landscape terrain around you. Can you describe it for her? It's like, why was that rain garden put there, I guess?
Well, I'll point this out when we start to travel, but the Arboretum largely doesn't have any real steep slopes, but it is far from being a level piece of earth. And when I look northwest from here, I can see that the Great Lawn is all sloping down here, and this part is sloping down. And actually, about where the perennial border is at the entrance to the White Garden, that's sort of the highest point, and water flows either one direction or the other. And you know, at that point, all of that is flowing this way. So in this area, it's all on a gentle grade going downhill behind me. And I'll reiterate the point I made earlier, that rain gardens are often not at the bottom of the slope, but higher up a slope to capture the water before it has time to travel downhill, eroding or washing mulch or whatever.
Very close to a spot where a lot of water had just naturally pools during heavy rains.
Okay.
On the opposite side of the walk.
Okay.
Nancy is wondering if this bed that you're in is identified on our maps. It is on our bed maps, probably as I think it was RG01 and RG02 or so. And it is not on our visitor guide map because it was made after the visitor guide map was created, and that visitor guide is now out of print, and we'll be working on that one soon.
Yeah, we have a lot of, the Arboretum doesn't stand still, so there are a lot of changes in the beds since the last time the visitor guide was created. Would the map be up to date on the Arboretum website?
The visitor guide on the website is the old one that was printed. That
Okay.
has not been modified.
Okay.
My guess is this rain garden might be a little bit small to be identified on the map, whereas the one near the color trials is identified on the map.
Yeah, well, you know, if I need to give you some landmarks, the rose garden is right there. You can see a little bit of rose bloom from here. The Great Lawn is right over there. And then the color trials are downhill from here. You know, this is the little wooden bridge across this rain garden that's in the mixed border.
And Chris has asked, please explain dry creek and rain garden connection. So maybe a little comparing of the two or contrasting the two. Oh, I was muted, sorry.
Okay, well, I heard the question.
Sorry about that, I was muted. I was just asking Chris's question. She's wondering what, maybe what the connection is between a dry garden, or a dry creek, excuse me, and a rain garden.
Well, I'm going to attempt to answer that question, but I might be wrong. I think a dry creek is more about looks and not about function. I think a dry creek is in a situation where there is no flowing water or even standing water. It's stone is used to suggest a creek. I know it's often done in Japanese gardens, but I don't think it has anything to do with rain gardens or water management. I think it's just a aesthetic thing. Does that seem like a reasonable
answer? That's what
answer?
I was thinking, along the same lines. And if it just happens to have water flowing in it, it's made for flow. It's not made to stop.
Yeah, but a dry creek is really, just for looks. Whereas the rain garden, I think we've established attractive plantings in our rain garden, but the main purpose is to deal with runoff. And I've been really happy with what they've done for us here at the Arboretum. Shall we move on?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do a little bit of moving. We're going to change locations, everyone. It's going to take us a little while to kind of reboot and get going, okay?
Yeah, so put your walking shoes on. I have just stepped out of the rain garden. The rain garden's right there. And you can see this Chapel Hill gravel road that used to wash out from the runoff. And now with the rain garden holding that water long enough so it soaks into the ground, we don't have that wash. And most of the year, we're a real small staff here. This time of year, through the generosity of supporters of the Arboretum, we have 5 wonderful interns helping us in the garden. But, we're always happy for something that cuts back on work. And then when we turn around this opposite direction, we're looking across the Great Lawn. And you can see it's sloping uphill. And about as far as, the whole Great Lawn, the runoff is flowing this way. It actually first ends up in this little side room to the rain garden, so it doesn't have to flow across this road. It goes through I think a 6-inch PVC pipe under the road and ends up in the rain garden where most of it collects. All right, we're going to take a little walk towards another rain garden we're going to look at. I'm going to stop here for a moment before we continue on to the next rain garden and just make the point that very often we're dealing with excess runoff because of man-made hard surfaces. And I'm standing on a Chapel Hill gravel walkway that's about 12 feet wide with concrete edging. Concrete edging originally was a mowing strip on this side because the turf originally went all the way up to these beds. But you would think that a gravel walkway might solve some of the runoff problem, but this Chapel Hill gravel is very fine and firmly packed, so it's probably not that much better than like a, concrete walkway or something like that. So we're dealing with more runoff because of these hard surfaces than if this was all, just flower beds or something. Okay. And so at this point, the water is flowing downhill and a lot of it ends up in the next rain garden we're going to look at. Okay. At this point, the runoff is coming down this path. Some of it's coming from this path and some of it's coming this direction, and then it all heads this way to our next rain garden. And if you put in a drain, make sure it's big enough to handle the runoff. This little, maybe 12-inch square drain is far too small for this location. Before the end of our time together, we'll shoot this rain garden from down below. This is the rain garden I referred to, where it wasn't so much that the runoff was causing erosion, but it would wash the mulch out of this area and cover a good part of this paved walkway below here. So now that we have this rain garden, we rarely have to clean up after a storm, which is amazing. This rain garden is in the part of the Arboretum known as Asian Valley. So surprise, surprise, the plants we have in this rain garden are native to Asia. You know, Asia, the mother of gardens, or China, the mother of gardens. And so we can talk about some additional plants that are suitable to a rain garden. Though there are a few ferns that want sun, I think most of the, no, that's not true. I'm having this conversation with myself in my own head. There are ferns that prefer sun over shade. That's a surprise to a lot of people. And some of the ferns that tolerate full sun are also dryland species, so they would not be suitable for a rain garden. But some of the ferns that love sun are also wet site tolerant. One of the best native ferns for this area is the Philiptris Palustrus. It's a very vigorous spreader, so you know, if you're going to plant it, you're going to have to understand you're going to have 10 feet of it after a few years or so. But it's really nice fern. But I'm off topic because I'm talking about Asian plants. So, but it's this fern that got me into trouble. This is Philiptris Palustrus, which I knew the swamp lady fern might be its common name. Palustrus, if you see Palustrus, then you're probably looking at a plant that would be good for a rain garden, because Palustrus means of swamps. Like the pin oak is Quercus palustrus and will grow in wet site. And initially, I thought that Philiptris Palustrus was native to North America, which it is, but it's not native just to North America, but it's native to sort of the whole circumpolar northern latitudes of the northern hemisphere. So also Asia and North America. And it's a deciduous fern that spreads fairly readily. At this time of the day, the spot is sunny, but it's far from being sunny all day. We met a number of iris in the first rain garden. This is a selection of Japanese iris, Iris ensata, one with a variegated foliage. In most nurseries, it's sold as Iris ensata variegata. Plant Delight's nursery, recognizing that nowadays you don't give Latinized cultivar names. Put the cultivar name of silver sword on this cultivar, and it's a really beautiful foliage plant all through the summer months. And Japanese iris are late blooming. You see, it's not even close to blooming. Maybe another 2 weeks or so before it blooms. But they're another plant that will tolerate periodic wet and just get better every year. They're a clump former, so well behaved. A plant that most people run in horror because it's a spreader. This plant with the yellow foliage is a yellow-leafed form of the gooseneck loosestrife, Lysimachia clethroides. Clethroides meaning resembling clethra, which is another genus of shrubs with spikes of flowers just like the Itea that we saw earlier. But Lysimachia clethroides does spread underground, but this golden leaf form is showy all summer and the flowers are quite attractive. These young plants I don't think are going to bloom this year, but I'm sure they will by next year. It's quite a good cut flower as well. Now this is something that is a really big surprise. This plant with the orange flowers is Trolius. It has, well, it doesn't have enough. I don't want to pick a foliage. Well, maybe I'll pick a leaf off for the purpose. What? What? You can get it? It has this highly divided leaf. If it looks a bit like a hellebore leaf or a aconite leaf, they're all in the same family, the ranunculus family. And the thing that I'm surprised about is that it's alive. There are Trolius that are common in gardens in the colder parts of the northern hemisphere, like in England and Germany and places like here, but I've never, or New England in this country or the upper Midwest, but I've never known them to survive. And this hasn't gone through a summer yet. These were planted last fall, so I might be premature in what I'm saying, but I'm thrilled, and you can see several more. We raised them from seed, and I'm thrilled that they managed to live long enough to bloom. And this is a species that's native to that northeastern part of China that's very cold up near Mongolia and Siberia, but not near Louisiana or Texas. But, you know, so check with us after this summer, see if they're still alive. Oh, okay.
Doug, we're getting to be about after the time we usually end, but we've had a lot of people asking about shade rain garden plants.
Yeah.
You want to go visit that little bit lower shade rain garden?
No.
A little visit? Okay.
No, because the one in shade, there's not much to see. We have 4 new rain gardens. The one that is in heavy shade, it was really dark, but now that the Nellie R. Stevens hedge is gone, we hope that it'll start filling in better. But
so come back soon to see it?
What?
I said, so come back soon to see that one?
This summer. But there are a number of shade plants in this area. The fern is certainly one that's better in shade than in all-day sun. Right here, a chorus, sweet flag. Plant probably most people know. You know, leaves in a fan like an iris, but it's not at all related to iris. It's used to be in the same family of aroids with calla lilies and stuff, but now it's in its own family. But a evergreen foliage plant that will grow in standing water year-round, but also tolerate intermittent moisture, so excellent for a rain garden, certainly shade tolerant. This bright yellow one, Ogon, is a little bit less bright the more shade you give it, but there's a white variegated one that looks the same, sun or shade, and of course green foliage ones. This is a Asian turtle head, which is a shade plant, and our native turtle heads are also shade plants, moist site shade plants. Our native turtle heads are Chelone, Chelone. This is a related genus. It's Cheloniopsis, meaning resembling Chelone, and it's a fall bloomer with pinkish flowers that reminded somebody of a turtle head. What else? Well, we have some ferns on the edge, but they're more sort of moisture lovers and might not tolerate, you know, standing water. But there are a lot of ferns that would tolerate standing water. I'm sure there's no end of lists of plants that could be used in a shade garden. You know, we have some Farfugiums that were planted last week, and they're a little thirsty. The one that you see most often is the one with yellow spotted leaves, but this is a variegated one. The cultivar is Argentea, meaning silver. I probably wouldn't put that in standing water, but certainly on the moist edges of a shady rain garden, it should be good. No, that's all right. Did we have questions, Chris?
Let me go check. So it looks like this is going to be a good time for questions. Doug, we do have one in the chat right now from Maria. Can nasturtium grow in a rain garden?
Can nasturtiums grow in North Carolina?
We don't know where she's
that's true.
Joining us from.
Yeah, that's true.
But if you are here in this area, I've never seen one all that happy here.
Right. That's why I answered that question with that question. We have nasturtiums in the color trials. They have been doing extremely well since they were planted yesterday. Check back, a month from now or later on this summer. I don't expect nasturtiums to really like our hot summers. Now, actually, watercress is a nasturtium.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Got another question, I think from the same person. Yep. Any bog plants, or any bog plants suitable for rain gardens?
Well, that gets to two botanical terms, two terms that ecologists use, obligate and facultative. And when it comes to what plants need moisture-wise, there's some plants that are obligate wet site plants. Obligate sounds a lot like obligation, same root. Those are plants that have to stay wet. They wouldn't be particularly good for a rain garden because a rain garden tends to be dry if rains are well spaced. Facultative plants are plants that can go either way. They'll tolerate the wet, they'll tolerate the dry. So, bog plants, if they're plants that have to have a bog, I wouldn't think they would be the best choice for the typical rain garden.
Or
I thought of another.
Give it a try.
Yeah, I thought of it. Well, yeah, you never know until you try. It wasn't until a tree fell down and left a shade garden in full sun that I learned that some plants we always thought needed shade were now out in full sun and even happier than before. But that's a different topic. I thought of another group of plants for shady rain garden, lobelias, our native lobelias, at least cardinalis and syphilitica and the hybrids in between. They're probably happier in a part sun garden than in a full sun all day garden, and certainly tolerate wet and periodic inundation.
Okay, our next question is do you do anything special for garden maintenance when it comes to the plants growing vigorously? In other words, do you have to thin them, remove them, let them go to town? What do you do?
You assess the situation and do the appropriate maintenance work. That's sort of a vague answer, but that's the nature of garden maintenance. It's a combination, a balancing of control and nurturing. This fern, I think, is going to eventually move and try to swamp the Trolius. And so at that point, it'd be time to remove the excess fern. And if the Trolius seems to be fairly good with us, but it's starting to peter out, well, maybe we plant more. So it's a balancing of both of those, and it requires making that judgment call periodically.
Okay. And Chris is wondering if pawpaws would make a good rain garden plant.
For a big rain garden, pawpaws spread underground generally, so you usually don't have one pawpaw, you have a big thicket. They are typically a moist site plant or floodplain plant, often near a stream or something.
We have a private question from Ruth. She was wondering where we can purchase the native hibiscus. Ruth, I know when I worked at a garden center, Hibiscus coccineus was a plant we regularly stocked. So if they don't have it, ask for it. They can get it.
Yeah.
I don't think regular Hibiscus mutatus is one that's commonly available. I think that one's usually used in breeding purposes. Well,
if you're willing to shop from mail order nurseries, you can find almost anything.
Yeah.
And there's a nursery that was here for the Raulston Blooms, our spring plant sale. Dirtbag Gardener in Orange County, North Carolina, that grows natives. They might have native hibiscus.
Yep.
There's Mellow Marsh, I think they're in Orange County, that specializes in native wet site plants. But lots of mail order sources.
Well, I think that takes care of the questions. If there are anything last minute ones, go ahead and get it typed real quickly, or better yet, come online, because we're getting ready to conclude today's program.
This rain garden was created last summer. It was a project that the last summer's interns created with the help of the farm manager and his assistant. It was created and planted in a matter of a couple days.
Well, there's no more questions in the chat, Doug,
Okay.
so we'll go ahead and conclude today's program. Thank you so much for joining us,
Quick
everyone.
question?
What's your question?
Well, I don't think you answered my question. At least I didn't see it in the chat.
Well, they do come by very quickly here on my end.
What is the iris that we're not supposed to permit to grow?
I did answer that one. That's most likely Iris pseudacaris.
Oh, what about it?
She was wondering what the yellow one that is sometimes considered to be invasive.
Yeah, you're
Yep.
correct, Tim. It's a European species that naturalizes in this country.
Yeah.
I've never seen much of it in North Carolina, but when I lived in New England, you'd see ponds encircled by it.
Yep, and that one's just the plain bright yellow one, Iris pseudacaris. So that one is printed in the chat for you.
Thank you.
All righty. Well,
All right.
I guess no more questions. Thank you
Okay.
so much for joining us, everyone. We're glad you could be here. And thank you so much to Doug for
Sure.
being today's guest lecturer, if you will. Thanks, Doug.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you both.